Welcome to my weekly review of the standard meta. Every week I like to go over the top performing decks in best of 3 and best of 1. Sometimes there's a budget list. This week we're going to start things off with the Artifact Ramp deck by Disc 3001, which was a best of 3 list that recently hit Mythic, and I thought was doing some pretty cool stuff. So the plan here is to ramp into strong artifact payoffs. So we have cards like Omen Hawker and the Enigma Jewel, which I totally... Where's the... there it is. Yes, the Enigma Jewel. And both of these give you colorless mana, or a colorless and a blue mana, if you can spend that mana to activate abilities. So it's not necessarily ramp, but if you combine it into things, you can kind of make it into ramp by using things like the Energy Refractor, where you can use it to activate to add 1 mana of any color. So, you know, this is giving you at least 1. You lose 2 colorless into 1, right? So it's a little bit, it's not perfect, right? But we've also got like Prophetic Prism, which allows you to just go for 1, and then Candy Trail as well, where you can use it to, you know, activate the Candy Trail and draw a card and gain 3 life. So after we got that we've also got Thran Spider, which similar to the Azorius artifacts list, gives you Power Stones that you can use to cast artifact spells, and then also give you some late game dig, where you can tap for 7 and look at the top 4 cards of your library and find an artifact and put it into your hand. So a little bit of a late game strategy if you can't find your threats. But we've got Tezzeret, which sort of acts as ramp. The first activated ability of an artifact you activate each turn costs 2 less to activate, and then also just allows you to use your smaller artifacts by turning them into 4/4s, or draw 2 cards and then discard 1 card if it's an artifact card. Otherwise you have to discard 2. And then if you do get it to the ultimate, you can do a 6 here. Whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. And then we've got like the Might Stone and Weak Stone. This is just a nice payoff. You know, being able to ramp simultaneously as either card draw or removal with the -5/-5 is pretty excellent. And then we've got like Cityscape Leveler and the Portal to Phyrexia are both just really great colorless artifact payoffs to get to. And then for the we've got a best of 3 sideboard going on here. So we've got 3 Disruption Protocols, 2 Jace the Perfected Minds, the Trajan Mindbreaker for an alternative win strategy. We can just mill our opponent. 3 Bowls of Porridge as an alternative artifact to bring in if you needed to like have some spot removal against some cheap stuff. Unlicensed Hearse for some really good graveyard hate, and then Realm Breaker, the Invasion Tree, which also works into the mill strategy. Next up on the list, I like to look at the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, and this week there was only one. There was only one on the 16th. So number 1 was taken down by Azorius Soldiers by Victor Carvalho 01, and it's same exact list as week 5, except for there was a small tweak to the best of 3 sideboard, taking out 1 Lauren of the Third Path for a Lantern Flare. And then number 2, second place, was taken down by Mono Red Aggro list by Sebastian Stuick 1, and this one was the same list that I covered in week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so won't be covering that one. But then third place here I thought was interesting, and we should take a look at it. So this one was Esper Midrange by Mogged, and kind of an interesting approach. So we've got no copies of Dinnik, Pious Apprentice, and upping 1 more copy of Lauren of the Third Path to a total of 2, taking up the Lord's Skitter to a total of 3, including the 2 Urtai Resurrected. I've seen this one kind of come and go, depending on what Esper list you're looking at. Childred the Apocalypse in the main, another one that sometimes ends up in the sideboard, but deciding to keep it in the main here. No Destroy Evils in the main, and instead we're getting a Spell Pierce, And I think this one, I think it's kind of a fun inclusion to bring this one in, just because like when you see Esper, you generally think about the wedding invitation and the virtue of loyalty, and so artifact enchantment hate has been being included in the main, but this one is kind of leaning away from those enchantments and leaning a little bit more towards countering your opponent's sunfalls and etc. So including one spell pierce here and two more copies of Go for the Throat for a total of 4, taking the Make It Disappears down to 1, and including an additional copy of the Subterranean Schooner. And yeah, so no copies of Wedding Announcement, no copies of Virtue of Loyalty, and then we've tweaked the lands a little bit. So +2 on the Underground River, -2 on the Sea Chrome Host. Sea Chrome Coast. +2 on the Restless Anchorage. So leaning more heavily into the man lands than you usually see in Esper. Usually, the more that you're strictly Azorius, you see this one, or the Restless blue-black land. Let's see, and then -1 plains, +1 island, -2 deserted beaches, and -1 darker wastes. Kind of just tweaking it to reflect the change in this being mostly Dimir with a little bit of white included for a couple of cards. And then it is a best of 3 list, so we've got 2 additional copies of Cut Down in the sideboard, 3 copies of Destroy Evil if you do find yourself up against that more enchantment-centric Esper Midrange build. Anoint with Affliction, which is really good against the Golgari to remove the Mosswood Dread Knight, or the recurring threat in Golgari. Disdainful Strokes, if you come up against like anything that has, Sunfall, Disdainful Stroke is a good time to get rid of that Sunfall. Negate as well. Parasitic Grasp, if you're up against the mono-white humans or mono-red and just need some more like early interaction. Tishana's Tidebinder, and this one can be kind of, you can bring this in to against other Shieldreds, you can bring this in against Adeline. There's a lot of cards that this hits. Even the Subterranean Schooner being able to, because like the activated ability of Crew, if you respond to it, then just makes the Schooner into a 3/4 artifact that just sits on the battle, or not even a 3/4 artifact, an artifact that just sits on the battlefield. And then we've got one more copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse. If you're feeling like your opponent is particularly weak to this build, Shieldred's really good against like mono red, for example, where gaining the life through the card draw can just win you games. Number 4 was Domain Ramp by Brunenho. And fourth place, yeah. So compared to the second version of Domain that I covered in week 3 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, very few changes to the main, so I didn't decide to bring it up this week specifically. But taking out 1 Courier's Briefcase and upping up including 1 more copy of Up the Beanstalk. And then there are a couple of changes to the best of 3 sideboard that I thought were at least worth mentioning. They decided to take out the 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor, or 2 copies of Knockout Blow, because we were seeing more mono red in the best of 3 circuit, and then decreasing Jace, Obstinate Baloth, because there wasn't really a whole lot of Lilianas, Chromos Sea Shark, because I think that like as an alternative win con, it wasn't really necessary, and this was to increase the number of to include an additional copy of Depopulate and 2 more Knockout Blows, if I remember correctly. I might have that one wrong. But anyway, mostly the same as what we've seen before. This one, though, it was a new one that I thought we should cover, is the Dimir Midrange, took number 5 in the standard challenge on the 16th. And this one's kind of like Esper Midrange, but without the white, right? And so it's leaning heavily into like the Deep Cavern Bat and the Spyglass Siren, being able to trigger Gix for additional draw. And then if we get Shieldred in play, those draws don't even hurt us, they gain us life. And you've got the Subterranean Schooner, which doesn't really draw you the cards through the Explore mechanic. that doesn't trigger, well, like Shieldred, but still just a really good way to explore with your flyers, make Deep Cavern Bat into a bigger, like a 2/2 flying lifelink instead of a 1/1, and everything that you're playing can crew the schooners. A lot of good early pressure. This is almost like a tempo deck, but I do think it's a little bit more. It's very close to being a tempo mid-range deck. How about that? So then we've also got Cut Down, this classic removal, Go for the Throat, Anoint with Affliction, just a lot of really good black removal. The 1 copy of Bitter Triumph, and Make Disappear, 3 copies of Make Disappear. So lots of disruption for our opponent's hand. And then since you're blue black and you're not seeing any white, then it makes sense to run the Manland with the Restless Reef. Gives you a 4/4 shark creature with Death Touch and also can mill. And you're not really going to be looking to mill your opponent very often, if ever. Really, I think you're just going to be doing that to yourself as kind of like a drawback a little bit. And then you've got Archfiend of the Dross to pressure your opponent. Kitesail Larcenist for like a little bit of removal. Kaito Shizuki to take advantage of being just in Dimir and be able to get some additional card draw and find your threats. And this is the best of 3 list, so we've got Cut Down and Duress in the main, Negate, Anoint with Affliction, Memory Deluge, which is kind of a 1 copy of Memory Deluge if you need to go like ultra long against control. Virtue of Persistence if you need a little bit of help against the early pressure. The -3/-3 and gaining 2 life is really nice. And then also it kind of gives you a little bit more late game mid-range inevitability with the being able to reanimate your threats. And we've got Disdainful Stroke and Path of Peril, really good for the go wide strategies. And then 2 more copies of Kaito Shizuki. And the Planeswalkers work really nicely. If you're struggling against cards like Sunfall and things like that, the Wraths don't affect Planeswalkers. So I think that this is really nice to bring in the more Wraths that you're up against. And the last list that I'm going to cover for best of 3, the rest of it will be best of 1. The last one was 6th place by Rakdos Midrange by Venom1. And I thought this one was kind of doing some interesting things. And we've covered Rakdos Midrange last week, and I think even the week before there were some interesting builds that we were starting to see pop up. I know some content creators were showcasing Rakdos Midrange, and the Rakdos space in general has started to see more play. I think part of it, at least I thought, was based off of Bonehorde Dracosaur. So what I found really interesting about this list was that we've decided it's deciding to take the Bonehorde Dracosaurs down even further, but to lean more heavily in like maybe tutoring them up as a way to have like 4 copies of them, and so the if we compare this to the list that I covered last week, we've got -1 Tenacious Underdog, so no copies of the Tenacious Underdog, only 1 copy of the Bonehorde Dracosaur, 4 copies of Trumpeting Carnosaur, which is the 7/6 trample dinosaur that discovers 5 when it enters the battlefield, and you can tap 2 and a red to deal 3 damage by discarding it to target creature or planeswalker. And so this can hit into the rest of our deck. Is a very powerful threat, has been working really well in limited, that's for sure. And including 1 copy of Anoint with Infliction in the main, and as well as 1 copy of Extract the Truth. And we started to see Extract the Truth make it into some of the best of 3 sideboards, and this is the first time I believe that I've seen it in the main deck. And this one is kind of interesting because it's an edict for your opponent's enchantments, feels particularly good against the Esper Midrange, but then also being able to use it to remove a creature, an enchantment, or a planeswalker from your opponent's hand makes it so that even if they don't have the enchantment, you still can find a decent target for this. So very curious to see how this one performs. And then 2 less copies of Go for the Throat. It is only able to destroy non-artifact creatures, so this does suck if they're like beating you up with a schooner, which has become more and more popular. We've got 1 copy, or down 1 copy of the Infernal Grasp, and up 3 copies of the Cruelty of Gix. So this allows us to hate on our opponent's hand more. So between like Deep Cavern Bat and the first chapter of this, we're really attacking our opponent's hand while gaining additional resources off of drawing additional cards through Gix. And then if we don't want to be attacking our opponent's hand, we can just read ahead to chapters 2 or to chapter 3. And so we're able to either tutor for something and put it into our hand at the cost of 3 life, if you want to go like find your Bonehorde Dracosaur, for example. Or you can put target creature, chapter 3, you put target creature from your graveyard onto the battlefield. So there's not really anything in here that's making us like draw and discard. So I think this one is a little bit more specifically just to hate on our opponent's hand and tutor the Bonehorde Dracosaur, but I have not personally tried out piloting the deck. We've got +3 Cavern of Souls, which I thought was kind of interesting because it's not a tribal deck. But the ones that we really don't want to get countered are both dinosaurs. So I think it kind of makes sense that, like, okay, we're going to use the Cavern of Souls as a way to make sure we get our big payoffs in the mid-range strategy. And then a couple more tweaks to the land, down 2 copies of the Black Cleave Cliffs, down 2 mountains, up a Restless Vents, which is the Rakdos Manland, down a Sulphurous Spring, and up 1 Swamp. And then for the best of 3 sideboard, we've got additional copies of Cut Down, Anoint with Affliction, Go for the Throat, a Braid, 1 copy of Brotherhood End to act as a Wrath, Breach the Multiverse if you need an alternative win con, Duress up against the spell-heavy decks, Extract the Truth, 2 more copies in the sideboard. If we really need to be hating on those enchantments, I imagine you would want to bring these in against like Esper Midrange. Liliana the Veil, which is really good at attacking your opponent's hand, so we can use the Cruelty of Gix and the Deep Cavern Bat and Liliana to really take apart the control decks, make them hellbent. And then we've got 1 copy of Gix's Command as an alternative Wrath to Brotherhood End, is just good for clearing the board and giving your big things lifelink. All right, the 5th one on the list, don't pay attention to my misnumbering, is Mono Red Aggro. And every week I like to look at what's the top performing deck that has at least 1,000 wins on Untapped. And a lot of times it's very repetitive, but this week we've started to see some changes. So if I compare this to week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, it's down 4 copies of the Bloodthirsty Adversary and is instead deciding to run 4 copies of the Charming Scoundrel, which I like because Bloodthirsty Adversary has basically been a Charming Scoundrel that doesn't have a Wicked roll on it, so it doesn't ping for 1 when it dies. The upside to the Bloodthirsty Adversary is if you do hit 5 mana, being able to replay your spells, and I feel like with how quick the meta is, that just hasn't been happening very often. So I like this change. We're down 2 copies of the Feldon Ronim Excavator, which I also think is another good change. Because of the Monstrous Rage, Feldon isn't really getting blocked anyway, and so it's a 2/2 haste, just like the Bloodthirsty Adversary, that can't block, which can become problematic when you are, losing the fight and like if you're playing like mono red mirror match and you're on the draw, right? And you're going to try to swing things in your favor. Feldon's not particularly good for that. It's better for that last little bit of late game dig, and just hasn't really been playing out terribly well. 1 additional copy of Godric Cloaked Reveler, which I love. Seen Squee and Godric tend to float around 2 copies to 3 copies to 4 copies of each. And the one downside is when you have 4 copies of a legendary, you can get situations where you have the card stuck in hand, right? And I feel like Godric has such a target on its back that you don't, run into that problem all too often. And being able to play Godric on turn 3 after Kumano comes in with the celebration is just a really good part of the mono red curve. So happy to see 4 copies there. And then 1 less copy of the Monstrous Rage, which I thought was interesting. Monstrous Rage is how you punish your opponent for blocking, and the higher you get in rank, the more likely that your opponent is going to play around Monstrous Rage, and then it's not as good. right? Like if you can use it to remove one of your opponent's blockers while also getting the trample damage through, it's really amazing and really good to punish blocks with this card, right? But it's not necessarily there's pros and cons. Where if your opponent is playing around it, then it's 3 damage in 1, which is a lightning bolt, which is not that bad anyway. But if you only have spells in your hand, one of the things that can happen is you draw a hand that's only Kumanos and lightning strikes and play with fires, and you're like, well, why didn't you mull that? And it's a fair point, but they decided to decrease the Monstrous Rage down to 3 copies. I think I like that, especially because the Swift Spear is also down to 3 copies. And in place of this, we're upping the Witchstalker Frenzy to 2. So Witchstalker Frenzy has been one that, like, I don't know, I haven't been totally sold on it. It depends on how many 4 toughness creatures you're really coming up against. Because, like, we've had Strangle for a long time, right? And Strangle has not made it into the main deck. And Witchstalker Frenzy is good at removing the things that Strangle doesn't hit, which would be 4 and more. So we've started to see a little bit bigger booties with the Schooner, right? So the Subterranean Schooner as a 3/4, I think makes the Witchstalker Frenzy a little bit more relevant. And I'm excited to check it out. So number 2 with over 1,000 matches is Mono White Humans, and this one is the exact same list as I covered in week 6 of Wilds of Eldraine. But because it has been so many weeks since week 6 of Wilds of Eldraine, I think it's probably worth bumping back up and making sure that you have the deck list at least in your repertoire. And if we compare this to the list that I covered last week in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we've got 2 more copies of Hopeful Initiate, up to a total of 3. No Lunarch Veterans, which was a tech brought in specifically against Mono Red. Upping the Skrelv to a total of 4. So really trying to counteract the amount of early interaction. 1 copy of Guardian of New Benalia, and this is one that, like I said, this is the same list from Wilds of Eldraine, right? Like this list doesn't really lean on the Lost Caverns of Ixalan cards, and Guardian of New Benalia is one that we've seen kind of come and go as a one of, and is particularly nice against red. Being able to discard a card to gain indestructible means that you can avoid your opponent's early interactions. So you can tell this is leaning more heavily into fighting our opponent's early interaction, less so about gaining life off of spamming the board and going wide with the Lunarch Lunarch Veteran. And then we've also got no copies of the Spellbook Vendor, or 2 copies of Ossification. So then the third top performing list with over 1,000 matches was the Mono Red Burn list, which was the same as the list that I covered in week 3 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and so I won't be covering that one. But then I decided this week, because we only had the 1 standard challenge in best of 3 to look at, and I kind of wanted to cover a little bit more in best of 1, that I would open up the field a little bit more and look at some of the lower decks with a fewer amount of matches that are, I have less confidence in because it's a smaller sample size, right? But there's still some interesting ideas going on here. So this will be the second version of Mono White Humans. This one was number 1 with 700 matches. So getting up there near 1,000, but not quite there. And if we compare this to the Mono Humans list that I did last week as well, they're ditching the 1 copy of the Hopeful Initiate, all 4 copies of the Recruitment Officer, which I thought was very interesting because I have not seen Recruitment Officer be one of the ones that gets ditched. And I do feel like its usefulness has not been as good recently. The 2/1 just hasn't been attacking very well early in the game, and then the amount of times that I'm actually digging with the Recruitment Officer doesn't happen that often, where that's like the games where I'm digging with the Recruitment Officer on 4 have usually felt like a lost cause anyway. That makes sense. And instead we're running 4 copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky, so like going heavy into the new card from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which if you can, it builds into a nice mid-range threat as long as you can protect it from your opponent's early interaction. We've also got no copies of the Intrepid Adversary, so interesting to see Lunark Veteran, but not then the 3/1 lifelinker. So it's not like teched super hard against mono red. But then we've got +3 of Kellen, Daring Traveler, and saw this a little bit in the mono white humans list in best of 3, and this one gives you some good mid-range dig. So we're kind of feels a little bit more like we're pushing away from a strict aggro deck with the recruitment officers into a little bit more of like a mono white mid-range, or a fast-paced mid-range deck. And Kellen also can be played as a sorcery to give you some map tokens, which is relevant in this list because they've decided to include Brushland, the green-white Painland, as an option to play Kellen, because you can't play Kellen off of the Cavern of Souls. So I thought that one was kind of interesting. And then no copies of Spellbook Vendor, down 1 copy of Adeline, Resplendent Cathar. We've seen this kind of fluctuate between 3 and 4. Sometimes, Adeline, if you draw all the copies of the Adelines in your deck, then you run into the problem of playing those legendaries. You can only have 1 legendary in play. And Kellen being able to dig for additional stuff, I think, makes it a little bit more likely that you're going to hit into Adeline. So with Kellen, I think 3 copies of Adeline makes sense. And we've also got 4 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, which is a little bit more of that go wide, mid-range, pump everything strategy. And then, we got Knight Errant of Eos as a way to tap all of those extra cards for additional dig, and like Brutal Cathar and things like that. But we did see they increased the lands to a total of 23 from 22, and other than the everything's the same except for the Brushland. Okay, the second one with 420 matches was Mono Red Aggro, and if we compare this one to the list that I covered in week 4 of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we see some interesting changes. And you can tell, like, this one is like, it's not as flushed out. It's doing a little bit more like random stuff than the ones that have like 1,000 wins. So we'll see if this is onto something. But we've got -4 Bloodthirsty Adversaries, which same as the list I mentioned above, has just not been performing quite as well, with the meta not letting you get to 5 mana as often. And we've got 2 copies of the Voldaren Epicure, which is something that we've seen more often in the mono-red burn list, being able to deal 1 damage and then create a blood token. And so it's kind of interesting to see this one in the main. And then we've got 4 copies of the Charming Scoundrel, so a little bit more on the ability to draw out of bad circumstances, I think, with these inclusions. -3 on Felden, which kind of reflects the same thing that we saw in the list with more matches won. Felden has just not been performing very well. And seeing 2 copies of Inti, which I think is a fun inclusion, because I do think that one of the things that Mono Red struggles with, and part of the reason to include the Voldaren Epicure, is those situations where you draw way too many lands than you need, or vice versa, you're stuck on 1 land, or you're stuck on 2 lands and you can't quite get to the 3 to make the deck shine. So I think that Voldaren Epicure and Inti kind of help the consistency of the deck. And one thing to note with Inti is that it's not always right to discard a card to give something +1/+1 and trample. So it's not an automatic, you should do it. Definitely think through if it makes sense. Generally, the earlier on is a worse time to do it, whereas later in the game, when you're getting rid of a land that you don't need, etc., tends to be a better option. And then we've got -1 copy of Squee, Dubious Monarch, and down to 2 copies of Monstrous Rage. So again, seeing some of the same decreases in both categories of mono red, less Monstrous Rages. We've got the Witchstalker Frenzies, included 2 copies there, and then 1 less copy of Sokenzan, which works really nicely with triggering Godric as a just like something that you can get out of your lands when you hit the additional lands. And I do think that because of the low land count, running 2 Sokenzan can be problematic, right? Being able to only have the one legendary land. So I really think this is leaning more heavily into consistency over the most ideal mono red curve, if that makes sense. And then one inclusion of Mirix, which I'm not sure I like. I haven't played mono red for a little bit. I mean, but I have a hard time imagining that if you're losing against a control matchup or a mid-range matchup that has shut down your early pressure, I have a hard time imagining that Mirix is actually going to get the job done. But maybe it does actually win a game. So the last deck that I will cover for this week is Selesnya Humans, which was number 3 with only 200 matches. So this is a very, very small sample size, but I do think, I covered a Selesnya Humans deck hit Mythic in Best of 3 at the end of Wilds of Eldraine in week 10. And but there's quite a few changes to this one, and I'm curious to see how this one will operate. Right, so this one has no guarantee of actually being like that good. I don't know how much confidence to put in 200 matches on Untapped, but still some interesting things going on here. So we're not running any Chaplain of Alms, no Enduring Bond Wardens, no Lunarch Veterans, no Intrepid Adversaries. So my worry is that this is going to be slow against mono red. But we've got Warden of the Inner Sky, 4 copies of that. We've got 4 copies of the Coppercoat Vanguard, 4 copies of Kellen, Daring Traveler, 1 more additional copy of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and this, just classic, like, the mono-white humans build, and then we're starting to, Adeline, of course, right? Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, up to 4 copies from 2. And then what are we playing with green is we're going to be playing some overpowered Selesnya cards that fall into the human strategy. So no copies of Augur of Autumn or Hamlet Vanguard, which was what the list was running that hit Mythic before the Lost Caverns of Ixalan cards. This list is deciding to run 4 copies of Brutal Cathar, which I think reflects the mono-white humans build. But we've got the Sigarda, two different types of Sigarda. So first one, we've got the Sigarda Champion of Light, which is an angel, so not a human specifically, but gives humans you control +1/+1 and is a 4/4 flying trample. That if you have Coven, which, looking through, being able to tweak like Warden of Inner Sky to what you want it to be, and like Adeline what you want it to be, I think this deck does Coven pretty well. You can look at the top 5 cards of your library and reveal a human card and put them into your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this helps you find additional humans. And then we've also got the Sigarda Font of Blessings, which is also an angel, and other permanents you control have hexproof. So really leaning into disrupting your opponent's interaction and protecting busted cards like Adeline. Is giving everything hexproof means like they have to target the Sigarda, which is probably why we you don't see any Skrelv, is that like we've got enough protection going on in that area. But the Sigarda Font of Blessings, you may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may cast angel spells and human spells from the top of your library. So this allows you to hit Sigarda Champion of Light as well as your other human synergies. So that's going to be it for the meta review this week. If there's an archetype that you think I should have covered and didn't, let me know in the comments below. Always love to hear your guys' feedback. And I just wanted to say on a quick note that I've really enjoyed the standard meta this year. I feel like it hasn't felt very stale, outside of maybe there being a little bit too much mono red. But if you're tired of the mono red, you can always play Best of 3, where mono red is practically non-existent. So I feel like the meta's in a pretty decent spot, and but I would love to hear what you guys think. Like, I'd love to hear if you've been having a positive experience with standard, if not, why, etc. So with that, I bid you all farewell, and I will catch you next week.